At my grandson's 7th birthday lunch, my daughter-in-law stood up, tapped her fork gently against her wine glass, and said, "Let's raise a toast to the old lady who's finally going to downsize and make room for the real family." For a second, I thought I must have misheard her. The restaurant was loud. Children laughing, plates clinking, waiters weaving between tables with trays of lemonade and iced tea. We had rented the private room at the Maple Grove Grill, a place with white linen tablecloths and oversized windows that looked out onto a small pond. Ducks drifted lazily across the water. The sun streamed in warm and golden, landing directly on the birthday cake, shaped like a baseball field. Everything about that afternoon was supposed to be cheerful. I just smiled and lifted my glass. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Sometimes I wonder how far stories like mine travel." My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 72 years old. I buried my husband 3 years ago, and until that toast, I believed humiliation came quietly. I was wrong. Laughter rippled across the table after my daughter-in-law's words. Not cruel laughter, exactly. The kind people use when they're unsure whether something is a joke. My son Daniel let out a short chuckle and rubbed the back of his neck. "Oh, Claire," he muttered, half smiling. "You're terrible." But he didn't correct her. Claire's lipstick was a shade too bright for lunchtime. Cherry red. It matched her nails and the ribbon in my grandson Mason's hair. Well, not hair. On the gift bag she'd chosen. She liked coordination, presentation, optics. She raised her glass higher. "Seriously," she added, her voice airy and light. "Mama's been rattling around in that big house all alone for years. It's time for a fresh start. Right, Eleanor?" There it was. My name, used like a prop. I took a small sip of sparkling water and set the glass down carefully. My hands were steady. They've always been steady. Even the day they lowered Harold's casket into the ground, my hands didn't shake. "I've always liked space," I replied gently. "It leaves room for memories." A few people nodded politely. My sister-in-law Margaret reached under the table and squeezed my knee. I didn't look at her. If I had, I might have seen pity. And I refused to be pitted. Mason was too busy tearing into wrapping paper to notice anything unusual. He had grass stains already forming on the knees of his khaki shorts. 7 years old. All elbows and excitement. He glanced up only long enough to shout, "Grandma, look, it's the Lego set I wanted." "I see that, sweetheart," I said, smiling at him, truly smiling this time. "It's perfect." I had spent 3 afternoons driving from one store to another to find that particular set. The deluxe edition. The one with over 1,200 pieces. Claire had mentioned offhand that it was a little overpriced. I paid for it anyway. Because that's what grandmothers do. The waiter appeared with the cake. Chocolate frosting. Blue piping. "Happy birthday," Mason written in thick, looping letters. Everyone sang. Claire recorded it on her phone, angling it carefully so the lighting caught her side profile. I clapped along. I always clap. But inside, something was shifting. Not breaking. Not yet. Just adjusting. After cake, while the children ran outside to chase each other along the pond's edge, the adults lingered over coffee. That's when the conversation turned practical. It always turns practical eventually. "So," Claire began, stirring her cappuccino though she hadn't added sugar. "Daniel and I were talking about the housing market. It's incredible right now. Houses in your neighborhood are selling within days." I nodded as if this were new information. "I've heard that." "And maintenance," she continued smoothly. "Roofs, plumbing, landscaping. It's a lot for one person. We just worry about you." Daniel cleared his throat. "We do, Mom. Worry. That word has layers." 3 years ago, after Harold's heart gave out in the middle of a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Daniel had shown up at my front door with groceries and a toolbox. He fixed the leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom. He replaced the porch light bulb. He stood in the kitchen and said, "You're not alone, Mom." Back then, Claire stood behind him, arms folded loosely, smiling with closed lips. Back then, I thought the smile meant support. Now, I understand it meant calculation. "I manage just fine," I said calmly. "The house and I understand each other." Claire laughed lightly. "Oh, I'm sure. But wouldn't it be wonderful to simplify? Maybe a senior community? They have yoga classes, movie nights, people your own age, people my own age." I looked out the window at the pond. The ducks had gathered near the bank, waiting for crumbs. "I've never been afraid of being alone," I replied. Daniel shifted in his seat. It's not about fear, Mom. It's about practicality. Mason will need more space as he grows. We've been thinking about expanding. There it was again. Space. Expansion. The words hovered in the air like invisible blueprints. The house Daniel was referring to is a 4-bedroom colonial on Willow Creek Drive. Harold and I bought it 34 years ago. We painted every wall ourselves. We planted the maple tree in the front yard the summer Daniel turned 10. Its branches now stretch wide enough to shade half the lawn. Every Christmas, I hang the same brass bell on the front door. Every spring, I scrub the porch steps with a stiff brush and a bucket of warm water. That house is not empty. It is full of first steps, full of science fair projects built at the kitchen table, full of Harold's deep laughter echoing down the hallway. But to Claire, it is square footage. To Daniel, it is potential. The waiter returned with the check. Claire reached for it instinctively, then paused. She glanced at Daniel. "Oh, Mom insisted on covering lunch," she said brightly. "Didn't you?" I hadn't insisted, but I reached into my purse anyway. "Yes," I said. "It's Mason's Day." The bill was just under $600. I slid my credit card into the black folder without comment. Claire smiled again. "You're always so generous." Generous. Another layered word. On the drive home, I replayed the toast in my mind. To the old lady who's finally going to downsize. She had said it playfully. That's what makes these things so effective. Cruelty wrapped in humor. Ambition disguised as concern. When I pulled into my driveway, the maple tree cast long afternoon shadows across the lawn. The house stood exactly as it had that morning. Solid. Unapologetic. I sat in the car for a full minute before stepping out. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish. I had cleaned the dining room the day before, just in case anyone wanted to stop by after the party. They hadn't suggested it. I had simply hoped. The silence greeted me like an old friend. I walked through each room slowly. The living room with its pale blue sofa. The hallway lined with framed photographs. Daniel missing his front teeth. Harold holding a fishing rod at Lake Harmony. Mason as a newborn, wrapped in a hospital blanket. In the kitchen, I ran my hand along the granite countertop Harold had insisted we splurge on during the renovation 15 years ago. "No one will ever push you out of here," he had said then, his voice firm. "This house is yours as much as it's mine." I believed him. Upstairs, I paused outside the master bedroom. I still sleep on the left side of the bed. I haven't moved his reading lamp. I'm not fragile, but I am observant. That toast wasn't spontaneous. Claire doesn't do spontaneous. She plans. She rehearses. She measures reactions. And today, she was testing the room. Testing me. I changed out of my navy dress and hung it carefully in the closet. Then I sat at the small desk by the window and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a manila folder labeled Estate Documents. I didn't open it yet. I just rested my hand on top of it. Because here's the thing about being called the old lady. You either shrink into the title, or you redefine it. I didn't argue at the restaurant. I didn't defend myself. I didn't remind Claire that this house is fully paid off. That Harold and I were meticulous with our paperwork. That assumptions can be dangerous. Instead, I smiled. And I noticed everything. That was her first mistake. That night, I didn't call anyone. I didn't cry. I didn't even open the manila folder. Instead, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table. The same oak table where Daniel used to do his homework while Harold read the evening paper. The house was quiet in that particular way only a large home can be. Not empty, just watchful. Claire's words kept replaying in my mind. Finally going to downsize. Finally. As if my life were an overdue project. As if I'd been stalling something inevitable. 3 years ago, after Harold passed, the house did feel larger. The air felt heavier. I remember the first morning I woke up alone. Sunlight spilled through the blinds exactly the same way it always had, but the bed beside me was cold. Daniel came over that day. He made coffee too strong and insisted on checking the breaker panel in the basement. "You shouldn't handle these things alone, Mom," he said. Back then, his concern felt protective. Over time, it shifted. Small comments began slipping into conversations. "Have you thought about hiring someone for the yard? That staircase is steep. Big houses aren't practical at your age." They were said gently, almost casually, but repetition changes the weight of words. Claire was more direct. At Thanksgiving last year, she had stood in my living room, hands on her hips, scanning the crown molding Harold installed himself. "It's a beautiful house," she said. It would be perfect for a young family. A young family. As if Daniel hadn't grown up here. As if this wasn't already a family home. I remember noticing that she said a young family. Not our family. After tonight's toast, those past moments rearranged themselves in my memory. Like puzzle pieces clicking into place. Conversations about realtors that stopped when I entered the room. Daniel asking vague questions about the deed. Claire mentioning how quickly homes on Willow Creek Drive were selling. I sipped my tea and let the realization settle without panic. This wasn't about my well-being. It was about timing. The market was strong. Their current house was small. Mason was growing. And I was, in their minds, the easiest variable to move. Upstairs, the hallway creaked as it always does when the temperature drops at night. I've lived here long enough to know every sound. Nothing in this house surprises me. Except, perhaps, the people in it. I stood, rinsed my cup, and turned off the kitchen light. Before heading upstairs, I paused at the front door and looked out at the maple tree. 34 years ago, Harold and I planted it with a borrowed shovel. You think it'll last? I had asked. It'll outlive us, he said. He was right. The tree is still here. And so am I. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I was upset. Because I was thinking. At 72, sleep doesn't hold you the way it used to. Thoughts come in around 5:30, quiet but persistent. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the furnace kicking on. Claire had tested the room at that lunch. But she had also tested Daniel. And Daniel hadn't defended me. That detail mattered more than the toast itself. By 9 o'clock, my phone rang. Daniel's name lit up the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. Hi, Mom. His voice carried that careful tone. The one people use when they're trying to measure your mood before committing to a position. Good morning, I replied. A pause. About yesterday. Claire didn't mean anything by it. You know how she jokes. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the maple tree. I assumed she meant exactly what she said. I answered calmly. Another pause. Longer this time. We just worry, he repeated. That house is a lot. And honestly, it would help us if, there it was again. Help us. He stopped himself mid-sentence. If what? I asked gently. He exhaled. If you considered selling. The market's high. You could get a great condo. Something easier. Easier. I thought about the stairs he mentioned. The yard. The maintenance. I've managed the house for 3 years alone, I said. What's changed? Silence has a sound when it stretches long enough. Nothing, he said finally. We're just planning ahead. Planning. After we hung up, I sat at the table with my notebook. I've kept one since Harold passed. Nothing dramatic. Just notes. Bills. Appointments. Observations. I wrote one sentence. They believe the house is negotiable. Later that afternoon, Claire texted me. We found a beautiful 55-plus community nearby. Thought of you, Red Heart. There was a link attached. I didn't open it. Instead, I scrolled up through older messages. Photos of Mason. Holiday plans. Recipes. And then, about 6 months ago, Daniel talked to a realtor friend. Just curious about values in your area. Curious. Another layered word. That evening, I drove past Daniel and Claire's house on my way back from the grocery store. It's smaller than mine. 3 bedrooms. Narrow driveway. Toys scattered across the lawn. Through the front window, I saw Claire standing at the kitchen counter, gesturing animatedly while Daniel listened. They looked focused. Strategic. For the first time, I understood something clearly. This wasn't concern. It was a timeline. And I had just been scheduled into it that evening. After driving past Daniel's house and seeing the two of them deep in conversation, I didn't feel angry. I felt awake. There's a difference. Anger is loud. It demands reaction. Awareness is quiet. It waits. I went home, set my groceries on the counter, and moved. Through my usual routine. I rinsed strawberries. I wrapped the loaf of bread in foil. I placed the milk carefully on the top shelf of the refrigerator. Normal actions. Steady hands. But my mind was no longer drifting backward. It was reviewing. I thought about the afternoon Harold and I signed the final mortgage papers. We had sat at the same oak table where I now keep my notebook. Harold had tapped the stack of documents and smiled. Free and clear, he said. No bank owns us. No one tells us what to do. We were proud of that. Proud of never refinancing beyond our comfort. Proud of paying extra each month when Daniel was in college, even when it meant postponing vacations. This house wasn't luck. It was discipline. A week after Harold passed, Daniel asked gently, Mom, where do you keep the important papers? At the time, I assumed it was grief talking. He was organizing, taking control of loose ends. I showed him the filing cabinet in the study. Third drawer down. Estate documents. Insurance policies. Property deed. He nodded carefully. Claire stood in the doorway, silent, watching. I didn't question it then. Now I do. I walked into the study and opened the cabinet. The manila folder felt heavier than it had the night before. I placed it on the desk and finally opened it. The deed was exactly where it had always been. Sole ownership transferred to me upon Harold's death. No co-signers. No shared clauses. No hidden arrangements. Clean. I ran my fingers along the edge of the paper. They believe the house is negotiable. But legally, it is not. I sat back in Harold's old leather chair and allowed myself to consider something uncomfortable. This wasn't a spontaneous push. It had been building. The comments about safety. The mentions of stairs. The links to senior communities. The realtor friend. The birthday toast. Layer by layer. Pressure without confrontation. I closed the folder slowly. If Claire expected resistance, she would be prepared for it. If Daniel expected tears, he would know how to soothe them. So I offered neither. Instead, I reached for my phone and searched for the number of the attorney who handled Harold's estate. Mr. Feldman was older than me by at least 10 years. Precise. Unemotional. The kind of man who reads every line twice. I didn't call yet. I saved the number to favorites. Because here's what I understand now. They are planning for my exit. What they don't realize is that I'm planning too. The following afternoon, I called Mr. Feldman. He answered on the third ring, his voice measured, exactly as I remembered. Eleanor, it's been a while. Yes, I said. It has. We exchanged the usual pleasantries. Health, weather, the passing of time. Then I told him I wanted to schedule a review of my estate documents. Is something wrong? He asked. No, I replied calmly. I just prefer clarity. He didn't press further. He never does. We set an appointment for Thursday at 10. After I hung up, I felt something settle inside me. Not fear. Not relief. Control. That evening, Margaret stopped by unannounced. She does that sometimes. She brought a small container of chicken soup and her quiet concern. I've been thinking about that toast, she said gently as she set the container on the counter. It didn't sit right with me. It wasn't meant to, I answered. Margaret hesitated. Then she lowered her voice. I overheard Claire talking to someone last month. At the garden club luncheon. She mentioned how perfect your house would be once they renovated the kitchen. Renovated. I didn't interrupt. She said something about Mason needing a bigger yard. And that timing was everything. Timing. There it was again. I leaned against the counter, folding my arms loosely. Did Daniel say anything? I asked. Margaret shook her head. He mostly listened. Of course he did. After she left, I walked through the house slowly, seeing it not as memory, but as asset. The wide staircase. The finished basement. The guest room Daniel once used as his bedroom. I could almost hear Claire describing it to someone. For bedrooms. Excellent neighborhood. Strong resale value. She was picturing new paint colors. I was picturing something else. On Thursday morning, I dressed carefully. Navy slacks. Cream blouse. Pearl earrings Harold gave me on our 40th anniversary. At Mr. Feldman's office, the air smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. He reviewed the deed, the will, the transfer documents. Everything is straightforward, he said. The property is entirely yours. I thought so. He adjusted his glasses. Are you anticipating pressure? I met his eyes. I'm anticipating expectations. He nodded slowly. Would you like to add a clause? Something protective. Protective. Yes, I said after a moment. I would. Because here is what I understand now. Claire believes I am the easiest part of their future to rearrange. Daniel believes I will eventually agree, for the sake of harmony. But harmony without respect is surrender. And I am not surrendering. Not quietly. Not at all. When I returned home from Mr. Feldman's office, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt prepared. There's a difference. Preparation doesn't show on your face. It doesn't change your tone. It simply adjusts the ground beneath your feet. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and stood still for a moment, letting the quiet of the house settle around me. The late morning sun fell across the hardwood floors exactly the way it always had. Nothing about the house looked threatened. And that, I realized, was the point. Pressure rarely announces itself as force. It presents itself as inevitability. That afternoon, Daniel called again. Hey, Mom, he said casual. Too casual. Claire found another listing. Just thought you might want to see what's out there. I'm sure there are many lovely places, I replied evenly. He hesitated. So you're thinking about it? I walked into the living room and ran my fingers along the edge of the mantel. The brass clock Harold bought at an estate sale ticked steadily. I'm considering all my options, I said. That answer satisfied him. I could hear it in his exhale. Good, he said. We just want what's best for everyone. Everyone. It's interesting how that word expands and contracts depending on who is speaking. After we hung up, I opened my notebook again. Add protective clause. No sale under pressure. No assumption of transfer. Mr. Feldman had been precise. If you'd like, he said during our meeting, we can add a stipulation that any attempt to coerce, pressure, or manipulate the sale of the property results in immediate removal from inheritance considerations. He didn't say Daniel's name. He didn't need to. I told him yes. The paperwork would be ready by Monday. That evening, Claire texted me a smiling emoji and a link to a moving company. Just for searching ahead of time. No pressure. No pressure. I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. Thank you, Claire. I've made an appointment to review my estate plans. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Then disappeared. Then appeared again. Oh, that sounds serious. Is everything okay? I set the phone down without answering. Silence, when used correctly, is not weakness. It's information. Later that night, I stood at the front window and looked out at the maple tree swaying gently in the dark. The porch light cast a soft circle on the lawn. 34 years in this house. 34 years of birthdays. Arguments. Reconciliations. Growth. They believe this is about square footage. They believe this is about practicality. But it's about something else. It's about ownership. Not just of property. Of narrative. Claire made her toast at my grandson's birthday lunch because she believed the story was already written. The old lady would downsize. The young family would expand. Everything would shift quietly. But stories change. And on Monday, when the revised documents are signed, so will the ending they've been counting on. Monday arrived without ceremony. No thunder. No confrontation. Just a gray sky and a quiet house. I drove to Mr. Feldman's office at 9:30, 10 minutes earlier than necessary. I've always believed punctuality is a form of discipline. When you arrive prepared, you don't rush decisions. Inside, the documents were already laid out neatly across his desk. Clean pages. Clear language. No emotion. He adjusted his glasses and slid the first page toward me. This clause, he said calmly, states that any individual who attempts to pressure, manipulate, or coerce the sale or transfer of your primary residence will forfeit their inheritance rights under the current will. The words were simple, direct, unambiguous. I read the paragraph twice. Then I signed. No trembling hand. No dramatic pause. Just ink meeting paper. When I walked back to my car, I felt something shift, not in anger, not in revenge. In balance. That afternoon, Daniel stopped by unannounced. He rarely does that anymore. I was in the kitchen slicing apples when the doorbell rang. I opened the door and found him standing there, hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders slightly tense. Hey, Mom. Daniel, I replied warmly. Come in. He stepped inside and looked around as if the house might have changed since yesterday. It smells like cinnamon, he said. I baked this morning. He nodded, but he wasn't here for pie. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where he once spilled orange juice before school and cried as if it were the end of the world. I heard. You met with Feldman, he said carefully. Claire moves fast. Yes, I answered. Is everything okay? I folded my hands loosely on the table. Everything is clear, I said. He hesitated. Claire thinks maybe you misunderstood her at Mason's birthday. I met his eyes. I heard her clearly. Silence settled between us. Mom, he began, leaning forward slightly. We're not trying to take anything from you. We just thought that it was time, I finished gently. He swallowed. We thought it made sense. For who? I asked. The question hung there. He didn't answer immediately, and in that hesitation, I saw it. The quiet assumption that my timeline would naturally bend to theirs. I updated my estate documents today, I said calmly. His head lifted. What does that mean? It means, I continued evenly, that decisions about this house will not be influenced by outside pressure. His jaw tightened slightly. No one's pressuring you. I held his gaze. That's good. Another silence. This one heavier. He stood a few minutes later, adjusting his jacket. We just want what's best, he said again. I know, I replied softly. So do I. After he left, I walked to the front window and watched him sit in his car for a moment before driving away. He hadn't expected resistance. Claire hadn't expected preparation. And for the first time since that birthday toast, I realized something important. They were no longer certain. And uncertainty changes everything. On Wednesday evening, Claire invited me to dinner. Not at a restaurant. At their house. The invitation came through Daniel, of course. Claire thought it would be nice if we all sat down and talked, he said over the phone. Clear the air. Clear the air. That phrase usually means someone wants reassurance. I'd love to, I replied. And I meant it. When I arrived at 6, the front lawn was freshly mowed. Mason's bike lay on its side near the garage. Through the window, I could see Claire moving quickly between the stove and the counter. She greeted me with a bright smile. Eleanor, I'm so glad you came. Her hug was light, controlled. Dinner was roast chicken, green beans, and a salad arranged carefully in a wide ceramic bowl. Claire pays attention to presentation. Even now, Mason chattered about school. Daniel nodded at appropriate moments. The conversation stayed safely above the surface. Until dessert. Claire set down a cheesecake and folded her hands. So, she began gently. Daniel mentioned you updated your estate plans. There it was. Yes, I said calmly. She tilted her head slightly. That sounds serious. It's responsible, I corrected softly. Daniel shifted in his seat. Mom just wants everything organized. Claire smiled again, but this one didn't reach her eyes. Of course. We just hope you know we'd never pressure you about the house. I took a small sip of water. I'm glad to hear that. A pause. Because, I continued evenly. The updated documents are very clear. Any attempt to influence the sale of my home would have consequences. The word landed quietly. Consequences. Claire's fork paused midair. What kind of consequences? She asked lightly. I met her gaze. Inheritance adjustments. Silence. Not loud. Not explosive. But complete. Daniel looked between us. Mom, that sounds extreme. Protection often does, I replied. Claire leaned back slowly. We were only thinking long-term. For Mason. For Mason, I repeated gently. I turned toward my grandson, who was busy scraping cheesecake crumbs onto his plate. When Mason grows up, I said calmly, I want him to understand something. Property isn't taken. It's earned. Claire's jaw tightened, just slightly. We're not trying to take anything. I know, I said, because now there's nothing to take. That was the moment. The shift. They had expected negotiation. Emotion. Perhaps guilt. They had not expected structure. Dinner ended politely. Too politely. As I gathered my purse, Claire walked me to the door. We just want to make sure you're happy, she said quietly. I looked past her toward the small living room behind her. I am, I answered. And for the first time since that birthday toast, it was true. Not because the tension was gone, but because the balance had changed. When I drove home, the night felt steady. The maple tree stood exactly where it always had, branches stretching confidently against the sky. Claire had made her toast believing I was already shrinking. Tonight, she understood something different. I am not moving, and neither is the house. The house felt different after that dinner. Not threatened, defended. For the next few days, the messages slowed. No new listings. No cheerful links to retirement communities. No subtle comments about staircases or yard work. Silence can mean many things. In this case, it meant recalculation. On Saturday morning, Mason had a soccer game at the community field. I brought orange slices and a folding chair, just like I always do. The air smelled like cut grass and sunscreen. Parents lined the sidelines with coffee cups and polite enthusiasm. Claire stood a few feet away, sunglasses perched on her head. She waved when she saw me. Friendly. Composed. Glad you made it, she said. I wouldn't miss it, I replied. We stood shoulder to shoulder, watching Mason chase the ball across the field. Daniel shouted encouragement from the other side of the goal. For a moment, everything looked ordinary. But underneath, something had shifted. During halftime, Claire turned slightly toward me. I've been thinking, she began carefully. Maybe we moved too fast with all that housing talk. I kept my eyes on the field. Perhaps, I said. We just want everyone secure, she continued. Life is unpredictable. It was a softer approach now. Less push. More positioning. I agree, I answered calmly. That's why everything is clearly documented. She adjusted her sunglasses. Daniel was surprised by the clause you added. I imagine he was. She studied my face, looking for anger. Or regret. She found neither. I hope you don't think we're opportunistic, she said lightly. Opportunistic. Another layered word. I think, I replied slowly. That timing reveals intention. She didn't respond. Mason scored a goal just then, and the field erupted in cheers. Daniel lifted his arms in celebration. Claire clapped enthusiastically. I clapped too. But as I watched my grandson run toward his teammates, something became clear. This was never only about the house. It was about control of the future. Claire believed that because I was older, my plans were temporary, flexible, subject to revision. Daniel believed harmony meant agreement. But security doesn't come from silence. It comes from boundaries. After the game, Daniel walked over with Mason bouncing beside him. Mom, he said quietly while Mason ran ahead toward the snack table. We're not fighting you. I'm not fighting either, I replied. He hesitated. It just feels different lately. Yes, I said. It does. He searched my expression. Are we okay? I looked at him carefully. Not as a son. Not as a boy who once needed help tying his shoes. But as a man measuring his next move. We are, I said calmly. As long as respect remains part of the conversation. He nodded slowly. That afternoon, when I returned home, I walked through each room again. Not to check for weakness, but to confirm stability. The brass bell still hung on the front door. The granite countertop gleamed in the kitchen. Harold's reading lamp remained untouched. Nothing had changed, except expectations. Claire had made her toast believing I would quietly accept the narrative she offered. But narratives are not inherited. They are decided. And I have decided. This house stays. A week passed without incident. No new suggestions. No strategic invitations. No, just researching messages. The quiet held. Then, the following Sunday, Daniel called. Mom, he said, voice measured. Claire and I were thinking, maybe it would be good if we all met with Feldman together. Just so everyone understands the plan. There it was. Not pressure. Access. They didn't want to push the house anymore. They wanted visibility into the structure around it. I don't see the need, I replied gently. Everything is already very clear. He paused. It just feels like we're being cut out. Cut out. I stood in the hallway, looking at the framed photo of Daniel at 12 years old, standing proudly in front of that same maple tree with a Little League trophy in his hands. I haven't removed anyone, I said calmly. I've only reinforced boundaries. Silence. Claire thinks. Daniel. I interrupted softly, not sharply, just firmly. What does Daniel think? Another long pause. I think this escalated quickly. I let that sit. It escalated at the birthday lunch, I said evenly. Not afterward. He didn't argue. That evening, Claire texted directly. I'm sorry if the toast came out wrong. It was meant to be lighthearted. I read it twice before responding. Words about someone's home are rarely lighthearted. 3 dots appeared, then stopped. Then a final message. We don't want tension. Neither do I. But tension isn't created by structure. It's created by expectation. On Tuesday, I invited them over. My house. My table. Claire arrived with a bottle of wine she knows I don't drink. Daniel carried a bakery box. We sat in the dining room. The room where Harold once hosted holiday dinners for 15 people without complaint. I want to make something clear, I began, folding my hands calmly. This house is not on the market. It is not pending evaluation. It is not part of a transition plan. Daniel nodded slowly. Claire held her glass carefully. I understand, she said. Good, I continued. Because I also want you to understand something else. I reached for the folder I had placed discreetly beside me. I have structured my estate to reward respect, not assumption. Claire's expression tightened slightly. I never assumed. You toasted, I said quietly. The word hung in the room. Daniel looked down at the table. I don't resent ambition, I continued. But I won't accommodate entitlement. No raised voice. No anger. Just clarity. For the first time since this began, Claire didn't have a quick response. Daniel finally spoke. We didn't mean to make you feel replaceable. Replaceable. That was the correct word. I'm not, I said simply. The meeting ended without fireworks. But something fundamental shifted. They had expected negotiation. They received definition. And definition, when delivered calmly, is far more powerful than confrontation. As they drove away that night, I stood at the front window again. The maple tree moved gently in the wind. 34 years. Still standing. And so am I. After that night, the atmosphere changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Daniel still called. Mason still waved when he saw me at soccer practice. Holidays were still scheduled. Dinners still happened. But the undertone had shifted from expectation to caution. Claire stopped sending listings. She stopped mentioning the market. She stopped using the word downsize. Instead, she became attentive. Too attentive. At Sunday dinner 2 weeks later, she complimented the crown molding in my dining room. The same molding she once described as dated. It has character, she said, tracing her fingers lightly along the wall. It always has, I replied. Daniel watched the exchange quietly. He has always disliked open conflict. He prefers smooth surfaces, predictable terrain. But something in him seemed unsettled. After dinner, as Mason played in the living room, Daniel lingered in the kitchen. "Mom," he said, leaning against the counter. Claire didn't realize how that toast would sound. I rinsed a plate slowly. It sounded intentional, I answered. He hesitated. She just thought it was inevitable. That eventually you'd want less responsibility. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands carefully. I want less noise, I said calmly. Not less ownership. He studied my face. You really think we'd push you out? I met his eyes. I think, I said gently, that sometimes people convince themselves something is practical when it's simply convenient. He didn't argue. That told me enough. Over the next month, small things continued to reveal the truth. At Mason's school fundraiser, Claire introduced me as Daniel's mom. Not the one with the big house. That detail did not go unnoticed. At Thanksgiving, when conversation drifted toward real estate, she changed the subject herself. The recalibration was real, but so was the memory. I do not forget easily. One afternoon, Margaret called. Seems like things have cooled off, she observed. They've adjusted, I replied. Do you trust it? Trust. Another layered word. I trust structure, I said. Because here is what I understand now. Respect that appears after boundaries is not spontaneous. It is strategic. But strategic respect is still respect. And I can live with that. Late one evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I looked around at the photographs lining the shelves. Harold, Daniel, Mason, 3 generations. I don't want division. I don't want estrangement. What I wanted, what I demanded, was recognition. That I am not a temporary obstacle in someone else's plan. I am the foundation of this one. And foundations are not removed for convenience. They are built to last. The maple tree outside my window has grown taller this year. Its branches stretch confidently across the yard. It does not ask permission to stand. Neither do I. Spring arrived quietly. The maple tree in the front yard bloomed earlier than usual that year. Small green buds opened along its branches, steady and unapologetic. I stood on the porch one morning with a cup of coffee and watched the sunlight filter through the leaves. 34 years ago, Harold and I planted that tree with dirt under our fingernails and no guarantee it would thrive. It did. So did I. The tension with Daniel and Claire never exploded into something dramatic. There was no shouting match. No dramatic ultimatums. Just a steady correction of assumptions. Claire never made another toast about my house. Daniel never mentioned downsizing again. Instead, when people asked about living arrangements at gatherings, Daniel would say, Mom loves her place. She built that home. Built. Not inherited. Not occupying. Not temporarily staying. Built. One afternoon, Mason came over after school. He dropped his backpack by the door and ran straight into the backyard. Grandma, he shouted. Dad says you planted this tree when he was little. I did, I called. Back, stepping onto the grass beside him. He wrapped his arms around the trunk as far as they could stretch. It wasn't even halfway. Will it still be here when I'm big? He asked. Yes, I said. If you take care of it. He nodded seriously, as if I had just entrusted him with something sacred. And maybe I had. Because this house was never just about square footage. It wasn't about market value or expansion plans. It wasn't even about inheritance. It was about permanence. About understanding that some things are not transitional phases in someone else's life. They are anchors. A few weeks later, Daniel stood with me in the driveway after dropping Mason off. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Not rehearsed. Not defensive. Just honest. For what? I asked. For assuming, he replied. That was enough. I didn't need him to confess motives or explain timelines. I didn't need Claire to admit calculation. I needed recognition. I'm not going anywhere, I said gently. I know, he answered. And for the first time since that birthday lunch, the word felt mutual. That evening, I walked through the house one more time, not to inspect, not to defend, but simply to appreciate. The oak table, the granite countertop, Harold's reading lamp, the hallway photos. Nothing had changed, except the narrative. At my grandson's birthday lunch, my daughter-in-law had raised her glass and called me the old lady who was finally going to downsize. Everyone laughed. I smiled. What she didn't understand then is something I understand now more clearly than ever. Age does not make you temporary. Loss does not make you weak. And ownership of a home, of a legacy, of your own dignity is not negotiable. The maple tree stands where we planted it. The house stands where we built it. And I stand exactly where I choose to. Still here. Still steady. Still mine.